A man named Clayton Graves, a scarred cowboy living out his last days in a world that had forgotten him. He was a man who had buried his guns and his past, content to let the world burn without him. But a new, vicious evil came to his doorstep, bringing fire and blood, and they took the one last thing he had left to love. The cabin was a ghost of a home, clinging to the side of a sun-blasted canyon in the heart of the Arizona-Mexico borderlands. It was a place of profound and very deliberate solitude, a place where the world ended and the vast, indifferent silence of the desert began. Its walls were of sun-bleached, warped timber, its roof a patchwork of rusted tin and hope. It was a tomb for a man who was not yet dead. The man who lived there was Clayton Graves. He was a ghost himself, the last, fading echo of a bygone, bloodier era. He was a man in his late 50s, his body a roadmap of a hard, violent life. His face was a mask of sun-baked leather. His eyes, a startling, pale blue, were usually clouded with the haze of cheap tequila and the ghosts of 1,000 painful memories. A long, jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent, puckered reminder of a knife fight that had happened a lifetime ago. He was a man who was, in all the ways that mattered, waiting to die. 20 years ago, he had not been a hermit. He had been a legend. He had been the leader of the regulators, a team of government-sanctioned and very deniable manhunters. They were not lawmen. They were the men the law sent when the law itself was not enough. They were the ghosts who cleaned up the messes, the surgeons who cut out the cancers that festered in the dark, lawless corners of the territories. Clayton, with his custom, silver-inlaid colt and his preternatural, almost supernatural, speed, had been the most feared and the most respected of them all. Then, it had all ended in a final, bloody, and very public massacre in a town called Redemption. A betrayal. A trap. His entire team, his brothers in all but blood, had been wiped out. He had been the sole survivor, a man left with nothing but his scars, his ghosts, and a profound, all-consuming disgust for the violent, treacherous world he had once so expertly navigated. He had taken his share of their last, bloody pay, had ridden into the deepest, most forgotten corner of the desert, and had, for 20 long, quiet years, been slowly, deliberately, drinking himself to death. His only connection to the world, his only reason to draw sober breath, was the small, struggling community of Mexican immigrants who had a small, irrigated farm in the valley below his canyon. They were a peaceful, hard-working people, and they had, with a quiet and questioning kindness, accepted the strange, scarred, and often drunk American hermit who lived in the hills above them. They would leave him food, a skin of fresh water, a bottle of tequila, at the base of his trail. They did not ask for anything in return. They were simply neighbors. And then there was Elena. She was the granddaughter of the community's patriarch, a beautiful, spirited, and kind-hearted girl of 16, with eyes as dark and as deep as a desert night. She was not afraid of him. She would sometimes, with a courage that both terrified and humbled him, make the long, arduous climb to his cabin. She would bring him fresh-baked bread, she would clean his small, squalid home, and she would talk to him. She would tell him of her dreams, of her hopes for a life beyond the dust and the struggle of their small, desert farm. She was the daughter he had never had. She was the ghost of the life he had lost. She was the one, single, fragile flame of light in his dark, empty world. The darkness, the one that he had been outrunning for 20 years, returned in the form of a man named Ricardo Alcuquillo Vargas. The knife, he was a new, and a very old, kind of evil. He was a bandit king, a man who had carved out a brutal, bloody empire in the lawless borderlands, his gang of red knives a plague on both sides of the line. They did not just steal. They terrorized. They destroyed. They were a force of pure, nihilistic chaos. And their greedy, malevolent eyes had now fallen on the small, prosperous, and very vulnerable farm in the valley. Clayton had seen them. He had watched them from his high, lonely perch, a pack of wolves circling a flock of sheep. He had seen their scouts. He had seen their numbers. And a cold, familiar dread, a feeling he had not experienced into decades, had begun to stir in the pit of his own, alcohol-soaked gut. He had tried to warn Elena's grandfather, the old, proud patriarch, Miguel. He had gone down to the valley, a rare, sober, and very grim visit. "You must leave," he had told the old man. "A great evil is coming. You cannot fight them." But Miguel was a proud man. "This is our home, Clayton," he had said, his voice a quiet, unbending thing. "We have bled for this land. We will not run from it." The attack came at dawn. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Clayton watched, from his high canyon, a helpless, impotent, and very sober witness to a massacre. He saw the red knives storm the small, defenseless settlement, their guns blazing, their faces masks of a cruel, destructive glee. He saw the smoke, he heard the screams, he saw the flames that consumed the small, neat homes, the fields, the very life of the valley. He was a ghost, watching a rerun of his own personal nightmare. The massacre at Redemption. The death of his own surrogate family. He was about to turn away, to retreat back into the numb, safe oblivion of his tequila bottle, to let the world burn, as he had for 20 long years. But then, he saw her. Elena. She had not been killed. She was being dragged, kicking and screaming, from the burning ruins of her home. She was being taken. And something inside Clayton Graves, a thing that he had long believed to be dead and buried, a thing that was harder, and colder, and far more dangerous than any amount of grief or tequila, awoke. He turned his back on his cabin, on his solitude, on his long, slow suicide. He walked to a small, hidden cave at the back of his property, a place that held the ghosts of the man he used to be. He rolled away the stone that covered its entrance. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was his past. His gun belt, its leather dark and supple, its holster tied down in the distinctive style of the gunfighter. And his gun, his silver-inlaid, custom-balanced Colt, the one they called the Ghost Maker. He strapped it on. Its weight was a familiar, terrible, and very welcome comfort. He was no longer the hermit of Scorpion Gulch. He was no longer the drunk who was waiting to die. He was Clayton Graves, the last of the regulators. And he was saddling his horse for one final and very bloody ride. The stand was over. The revenge was about to begin. The ghost that awoke in the heart of Clayton Graves was not a creature of sorrow or regret. It was a cold, pure, and very beautiful instrument of wrath. The 20 years of alcoholic haze, of self-pity, of a deliberate, soul-crushing inertia, had been burned away in the hot, white fire of the massacre he had just witnessed. All that was left was the man he had once been, a man whose entire existence had been a study in the brutal, efficient, and very personal application of violence. He did not rush. He did not panic. He moved with a slow, deliberate, and chillingly calm purpose. He was a master of his trade, and the first step in any hunt was preparation. He went back into his small, dilapidated cabin. It was not a home anymore. It was a field office. He took a long, deep swallow of water from his canteen, the clean, cold liquid a stark, and a very necessary, contrast to the tequila that had been his constant companion for 2 decades. He was sober. He would need to be. He then went to work. He was not just a gunfighter, he was a master of the terrain, a man who had spent 20 years in a silent, solitary communion with the desert. He knew its secrets, its rhythms, its hidden, deadly traps. And he was about to turn the desert itself into a weapon. From a hidden cache beneath the floorboards of his cabin, he took out his tools. They were not the tools of a rancher or a prospector. They were the tools of a professional, and a very creative, killer. There was a coil of thin, strong, and almost invisible piano wire. There were a half-dozen, custom-made, and very powerful steel traps, their jaws capable of snapping a man's leg in two. And there was a collection of small, sealed, clay pots. He opened one of the pots. Inside was a thick, dark, and very viscous liquid. It was a poison, a slow-acting, but incredibly potent, nerve agent he had learned to distill from the venom of the desert's most deadly scorpions. A single, tiny drop, introduced into a water source, would be enough to cause a slow, agonizing, and very debilitating sickness. He was not just a gun. He was an arsenal. He was a force of nature. He spent the rest of the day in a state of cold, focused, and very deadly meditation. He was not just preparing his tools, he was preparing his mind. He was resurrecting the ghost of the man he had been, relearning the cold, hard, and utterly emotionless calculus of the hunt. He was stripping away the last, soft, and very human remnants of the man who had loved a girl named Elena. All that was left was the predator. As dusk fell, he was ready. He was dressed not in the ragged, homespun clothes of the hermit, but in the dark, practical, and very anonymous clothes of the hunter. He had a second, loaded pistol tucked into his belt, the long, heavy blade of a bowie knife strapped to his boot. His silver-inlaid Colt, the Ghostmaker, was in its holster, its weight a familiar, and a very deadly, comfort. He mounted his horse, a tough, weary, and very intelligent Mustang that was as much a creature of this desert as he was. He did not ride down into the valley, to the smoking, silent ruins of the settlement. He knew that was not where he would find them. He knew his enemy. He knew men like Ricardo Alcuquillo Vargas. They were not just brutes. They were strategists. After a raid, they would not retreat back to their main stronghold. They would go to a temporary hidden and very defensible outpost, a place to count their loot, to rest their horses, and to celebrate their victory. And Clayton knew exactly where that outpost would be. An old, abandoned, and very much haunted Spanish mission, a place called La Iglesia de los Huesos, the Church of Bones, a 2-day ride to the south, deep in the heart of the most lawless and the most dangerous part of the borderlands. He rode out, a solitary, dark figure against the vast, blood-red canvas of the setting sun. He was no longer a man who was running from his past. He was a man who was riding to embrace it. He was a ghost, and he was riding to a church. But he was not going to pray. He was going to deliver a final, and a very personal, and a very bloody sermon. The journey to La Iglesia de los Huesos was a pilgrimage into the heart of a dead land. For 2 days, Clayton Graves rode through a landscape that was a testament to the slow, patient, and very brutal power of the desert. It was a world of sun-baked, cracked earth, of skeletal, thorny cacti, of a sky that was a vast, empty, and utterly indifferent bowl of blue. He rode with a steady, relentless, and very efficient pace, his body, which had been softened by 20 years of alcoholic neglect, now responding to the call of his iron will, the old, hard muscles remembering their purpose. He did not follow the main, dusty trails. He moved through the hidden, forgotten arroyos, the secret, winding canyons, a path that was known only to the ghosts and to the predators of this land. He was a part of the landscape now, his dark, anonymous figure a moving piece of the desert's own, harsh, and very deadly soul. He found the Church of Bones on the evening of the second day. It was a skeleton of a building, its adobe walls crumbling, its bell tower a silent, gaping mouth that had long ago forgotten the sound of a bell. It was surrounded by a graveyard of unmarked, stone-piled graves, a place where the forgotten and the damned of a dozen different border wars had been laid to a restless and very unholy rest. It was a perfect place for a pack of wolves to lick their wounds and count their stolen treasures. He did not ride in. He left his horse a mile away, in a hidden, box canyon, and he made the final approach on foot, a silent, creeping shadow in the deep, purple twilight. He found a position on a high, rocky ridge that overlooked the entire, ruined mission complex. He lay flat on the cold, hard stone, a patient, and a very deadly, statue of vengeance. He saw them, the red knives. They were all there, a dozen of them, their figures dark silhouettes against the flickering, cheerful light of a large, central campfire. They were in a state of drunken, triumphant celebration. They were passing bottles of whiskey, their loud, crude laughter a profane, ugly sound that echoed in the sacred, and now very desecrated, silence of the old mission. He saw their leader, Ricardo Alcuquillo Vargas. He was a tall, handsome man, with a cruel, thin mustache and the cold, dead eyes of a snake. He was the man who had, for a brief, terrible moment, held the fate of Elena in his hands. He was the man who was at the very top of Clayton's very short, and very final. And then, he saw her. Elena. She was not a part of their celebration. She was tied to a post at the edge of the firelight, a solitary, defiant figure of innocence in a den of pure, unadulterated evil. Her face was smudged with soot, her clothes were torn, but her eyes, even from this distance, blazed with the fire of a proud and an unbroken spirit. She was her grandfather's granddaughter, and she was, in her own quiet way, the daughter of the ghost who was now watching over her. Clayton felt a hot, white flash of pure, unadulterated rage, a feeling so powerful it was a physical thing. But he packed it down into the cold, hard, and very professional place where the killer in him lived. Rage was a luxury. It made a man careless. And he could not afford to be careless. Not now. He spent the rest of the night on that high ridge, a patient, and a very cold, and a very sober observer. He was not just a gunfighter. He was a tactician. He was the regulator. He was studying his battlefield. He memorized the layout of the ruined mission. He learned the patterns of their drunken, lazy sentries. He saw where they kept their horses. He saw where they stored their supplies. And he began to formulate his plan. It would not be a direct, frontal assault. That was not his way. That was the way of a fool, a brawler. His way was the way of the ghost. A way of silence, of stealth, of a slow, meticulous, and very personal, and a very terrifying dismantling of his enemy. He would not just kill them. He would haunt them. He would turn their sanctuary, their place of triumph, into a tomb. He would make them pay, not just for what they had done to his valley, to his people, to his girl, but for the very sin of their own brutal existence. As the first, pale, gray light of the new dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Clayton Graves, the last of the regulators, the ghost of Scorpion Gulch, began his descent. He was a solitary, dark figure, moving down from the high, cold places of the desert. He was a priest of a very old, and a very bloody, and a very final kind of religion. And he was about to deliver his first, and a very unforgiving sermon, in the Church of Bones. The sermon that Clayton Graves delivered in the Church of Bones was not one of words. It was a sermon of silence, of fear, and of a slow, creeping, and very personal, and a very terrifying kind of damnation. He did not begin with the men. He began with their world. He began with their water. He moved with a supernatural, ghost-like silence to the single, still-lined well that was their only source of fresh water in this dry, thirsty land. He took out one of his small, clay pots. He uncorked it. He let a single, dark, viscous drop of the scorpion poison fall into the depths of the well. It was a silent, invisible, and very patient kind of death. In a day, the men who drank from this well would be in the grip of a feverish, debilitating sickness, their bodies at war with themselves, their minds clouded with a delirious, and a very painful, kind of madness. His next target was their horses. They were the lifeblood of any outlaw gang, their means of escape, the very symbol of their freedom. He did not kill them. That would be a noisy, and a very wasteful, cruelty. He moved to the makeshift corral where the horses were kept, a single, dozing sentry their only guardian. The sentry never heard him. The man's last sensation on this earth was the soft, almost gentle, whisper of Clayton's Bowie knife, a silent, final, and very professional end. Clayton then went to work. He did not use a gun. He used his hands. He moved among the horses, his touch surprisingly gentle, his whispers a soft, soothing murmur. He was not just a killer of men, he was a master of animals. And he used his lariat, his knowledge of knots, and his deep, intimate understanding of a horse's anatomy. He did not lame them. He did something far more clever, and far more damaging. He hobbled them, with a series of intricate, and very strong, and very difficult to untie knots, connecting each horse to the other, creating a single, chaotic, and very much immobile, tangled mass of horseflesh. Their cavalry was now a single panicked, and very stationary target. His final, preparatory act was the most important of all. He moved to the small, crumbling, and very much abandoned, bell tower of the old church. He climbed it, his movements the silent, agile motions of a man half his age. He found the old, iron bell, its surface a testament to a century of sun and silence. And he attached a long, thin, and very strong piece of his piano wire to its clapper. He then ran the wire, a silent, almost invisible, and very deadly thread, from the bell tower, across the compound, to a high, rocky outcrop that overlooked the entire scene. His stage was set. His sermon was prepared. Now, all he needed was his congregation. He waited until the sun was at its zenith, until the heat was at its most oppressive, until the outlaws were at their laziest, their minds dull with the after effects of their night of celebration. He then, from his hidden position, pulled the wire. The sound of the old iron bell, a sound that had not been heard in that desolate place in 100 years, was a shocking, profound, and a very terrifying thing. It was not a cheerful, welcoming sound. It was a deep, resonant, and very mournful bong, a sound that seemed to be the tolling of a bell for the damned. The outlaws, who had been dozing in the shade, were jolted to their feet, their faces a mask of confused and very superstitious terror. Bong. The bell tolled again, a slow, deliberate, and very final rhythm. And as their eyes were turned towards the haunted, impossible sound of the bell tower, Clayton Graves opened fire. He was not using his Colt. He was using a long-range, heavy, and very accurate Sharps rifle that he had taken from the body of one of the sentries. He was a master of all the tools of his trade. His first shot was not at a man. It was at the large, communal pot of coffee that was simmering over their central campfire. The heavy, .50 caliber slug struck the pot with a force that made it explode, a geyser of hot, black coffee and steam that was a shocking, and a very painful surprise to the men who were standing near it. His second shot was at the last remaining, and very full, barrel of whiskey that sat at the edge of their camp. The barrel erupted, a fountain of precious, and very flammable, liquid. He had not killed a single man, but he had, in the space of 30 seconds, destroyed their water, their horses, their coffee, and their whiskey. He had destroyed their world. He had stripped them bare. The outlaws, their minds now a raging, chaotic storm of fear and a dawning, terrible understanding, began to fire wildly, at the bell tower, at the rocks, at the shadows. It was into this chaos that Clayton Graves, the ghost of Scorpion Gulch, the last of the regulators, now walked. He emerged from the rocks, not as a sniper, not as a ghost, but as a man, a tall, grim-faced, and very much flesh and blood angel of death, his silver-inlaid Colt, the ghost maker, now in his hand. The first, terrible, and very bloody sermon was over. The final, and very personal, and very deadly, and very much face-to-face, lesson was about to begin. The Church of Bones had become a shooting gallery, a chaotic, sun-baked arena of death, and Clayton Graves was the only man who knew the rules of the game. He walked out of the cover of the rocks and into the open, a deliberate, and a very public, declaration of war. He was a solitary, grim-faced figure, the dust of the compound swirling around his boots, his silver-inlaid Colt held in a steady, and a very professional, and the outlaws, who had been firing wildly at the ghosts in the rocks, now had a target, a real, flesh and blood, and very much mortal, target. Their initial, superstitious terror was replaced by a hot, and a very foolish, surge of collective, masculine rage. They were a dozen, armed men. He was one. The math was simple. They turned their guns on him, a ragged, and disciplined, and very panicked volley of fire. But they were not fighting a man. They were fighting a legend. And they were fighting him on his own, very well-prepared ground. Clayton moved with a speed that was not human. It was not the flashy, showy speed of a saloon gunfighter. It was the economical, efficient, and utterly deadly speed of a man for whom the gunfight was a science, a geometry of angles and trajectories. He did not stand and trade shots. He used the terrain. He had spent the night not just preparing his traps, but memorizing the layout of the compound, the placement of every rock, every crumbling adobe wall, every piece of cover. He was a ghost, and he was moving through a landscape of his own, very deadly, design. He fired his Colt, the ghost maker, and it did not just make a sound. It sang, a deep, resonant, and very final song. His first shot took the man who was closest to him, a clean, precise, and very final shot to the center of the chest. The man was dead before he hit the ground. He was moving as he fired, low, weaving, and very difficult to hit target. He dug behind a crumbling stone altar, the same altar where, 100 years ago, a priest had held up a cross. Clayton was holding a Colt, and he was offering a very different, and a very final, kind of absolution. Two of the outlaws, their courage bolstered by their numbers, charged his position, their pistols roaring. Clayton fired from the cover of the altar. He did not fire at the men. He fired at the loose, crumbling adobe wall just above their heads. The heavy .45 caliber slugs from his Colt, fired with a blacksmith's brutal, percussive force, chewed at the old, sun-baked brick. The wall, which had been weakened by a century of sun and rain, gave way, a shower of dust and heavy, man-sized chunks of adobe crashing down on the two charging men, burying them in a tomb of their own foolish aggression. The other outlaws, their courage now faltering, their numbers dwindling, began to fall back to seek the cover of the main, ruined church building. It was then that Ricardo Alcuquillo Vargas, the leader, the man who was the true and only target of Clayton's wrath, finally acted. He was not a fool. He was a survivor. He saw that this was not a fight that could be won with bullets. This was a fight that could only be won with a different, and a far more personal, kind of brutality. He did not join the fight. He ran, not away from the battle, but towards it. He ran towards the post where Ono was still tied, a helpless, terrified, and very valuable pawn in this deadly game. He drew his own long and very wicked-looking knife. He was going to take a hostage. He was going to take the ghost's one and only weakness. Clayton saw him. He saw Vargas's intent, and his cold, professional detachment was, for a single, terrible moment, shattered. He let out a roar, a sound of pure, primal, and very paternal rage. He broke from his cover, his own personal safety now a distant, and a very unimportant, consideration. He charged, a direct, and a very suicidal, run across the open, bullet-swept ground, his Colt now empty, the long, heavy blade of his Bowie knife in his hand. He was no longer the regulator. He was no longer the ghost. He was a father, and he was running to save his child. The two men, the scarred, aging cowboy and the handsome, deadly bandit king, were on a collision course. The final, bloody, and very personal battle for the soul of a girl, and for the ghost of a man, was about to be fought, not with the clean, distant finality of the gun, but with the up-close, intimate, and very brutal truth of the blade. The world of the gunfight, which had been a thing of noise and distance, and the cold mathematical calculus of trajectories, now shrank to a small, intimate, and very personal space. It was the space of a man's reach, the space of a knife's edge. Clayton Graves and Ricardo Alcuquillo Vargas met in the center of the dusty, sun-baked compound, a whirlwind of dust and sweat, and a very pure, and a very primal, hatred. It was not a duel of gentlemen. It was a brawl, a close quarters, life-or-death struggle between two very different, but equally deadly, masters of the blade. Vargas was a creature of speed and grace, his long, thin knife a flickering, silver serpent in his hand. He was a dancer, a fencer, his style a thing of elegant, and very deadly, precision. Clayton was a creature of power and a brutal, efficient economy. His heavy, broad-bladed Bowie knife was not a thing of grace. It was a tool, a cleaver, a thing designed to break, to shatter, to overwhelm. They circled each other, their boots shuffling in the dust, their eyes locked, each man taking the measure of the other. The remnants of the gunfight, the shouts, the occasional, sporadic shot, it all faded away, a distant, and important backdrop to this central, and very final, drama. Vargas made the first move. He lunged, his knife a blur of motion, a feint to the left, a quick, deadly slash to the right, aimed at Clayton's gun hand. But Clayton was not a young man. He was not a fast man. He was a smart man. He did not try to parry the slash. He moved, not back, but inside the reach of Vargas's blade, a shocking, and a very dangerous, move. He took a shallow, burning cut on his forearm, a price he was willing to pay. And as he moved in, he brought his own massive, and very powerful frame to bear. He was not a fencer. He was a wrestler. He was a blacksmith. He crashed into Vargas, his shoulder driving into the smaller man's chest, the force of the impact taking the bandit king's breath away, sending him staggering back. The two men grappled, a desperate, sweating, and very brutal embrace. It was a fight of muscle and leverage, of a desperate, grunting, and very human struggle for dominance. Vargas, for all his grace, was no match for Clayton's raw, brute strength. Clayton forced him to the ground, the dust of the compound a choking, gritty cloud around them. But Vargas was a serpent. He was at his most dangerous when he was cornered. As they wrestled in the dust, his free hand was scrabbling at his boot. He drew a second, smaller, and very wicked-looking stiletto, its blade no bigger than a man's finger. He drove the small, sharp blade into Clayton's side, a desperate, and a very lucky, strike. Clayton let out a roar, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain and fury. The fire in his side was a hot, white, and a very debilitating thing. He felt his strength beginning to fade, his vision graying out at the edges. Vargas, seeing his advantage, pressed his attack. He writhed, he twisted, he tried to bring his main blade to bear, to deliver the final, killing blow. But Clayton Graves was a man who had lived his entire life on the knife's edge. He was a man who had been cut, handshot, and left for dead a dozen times before. Pain was an old, and a very familiar friend. He did not give up. He did not let go. He held on, his own massive hand of ice on Vargas's knife hand, his other arm a band of iron around the man's chest. And as he held on, his mind, which had been a red, hazy fog of pain and rage, began to clear. He was a regulator. He was a tactician. He was a man who saw the angles. He saw his chance. It was a desperate, and a very final, gamble. With his last, remaining ounce of strength, he did not try to fight the knife. He did not try to overpower the man. He did a simple, and a very unexpected thing. He let go. He released his grip on Vargas's knife hand and in the same, fluid motion, he drove his own, free hand, not the one with the knife, but his empty hand, into Vargas's face. His thumb finding the soft, vulnerable pressure point of the man's eye. Vargas screamed, a high, thin, and very animal sound of pure, unadulterated agony, his body arching, his own knife falling from his suddenly nerveless hand. It was the opening Clayton needed. He brought his own heavy Bowie knife around, not in a slash, not in a stab, but in a final, brutal, and very personal, and a very just, act of retribution. The long, bloody, and very personal war was over. The last of the red knives was dead, and Clayton Graves, the ghost of Scorpion Gulch, stood, a wounded, bleeding, and very much victorious figure, over the body of his vanquished enemy. The silence of the desert once again descending on the Church of Bones. The silence that followed the death of Ricardo Vargas was profound and absolute, broken only by Clayton's own, ragged, and very painful, breathing. He stood over the body of his enemy, the bloody Bowie knife in his hand, the world a gray, swimming haze of pain and a deep, bone-crushing exhaustion. The fire of his rage, the thing that had fueled him, the thing that had driven him on this long, bloody road to vengeance, was gone, leaving only the cold, empty ashes of a victory that felt, in its own, strange way, like a defeat. He had won. He had killed them all. He had avenged the people of the valley. He had saved the girl. But the cost had been a steep one. The ghost of the regulator, the cold, hard, and very deadly killer he had tried for so long to bury, was now fully, and perhaps irrevocably, resurrected. And he did not know if he had the strength, or the will, to bury him again. He heard a sound behind him, a small, choked sob. He turned, his body a single, screaming symphony of pain. Alna was there. She had, in the chaos of the final moments of the fight, been cut free by one of the last, dying outlaws, in a final, futile attempt to use her as a shield. She was standing there, her hands to her mouth, her dark, beautiful eyes wide with a mixture of horror, of gratitude, and of a new, and a very profound, and a very adult, understanding. She was not looking at the body of Vargas. She was looking at him. She was seeing not just the grizzled, kind, and often drunk old hermit she had befriended. She was seeing the man he truly was. A killer. A legend. A ghost. Clayton, she whispered, her voice a small, trembling, and very frightened sound. He looked down at his own bloody hands, at the knife he still held. He was a monster. He had become the very thing he had spent a lifetime hunting. He had saved her, but he had, in the process, destroyed the one, simple, and very innocent thing that had been his own last, and very fragile, connection to the world of men. Her own innocent belief in him. He dropped the knife. The clatter of it on the stone floor of the mission courtyard was a loud, and a very final, sound. He turned and stumbled away, away from her, away from the bodies, away from the ghost of what he had just done. He went to the well he had poisoned. He drew a bucket of the tainted water. He was a man who had dealt in death, and it was only right that he should now drink of its cup. But as he was about to drink, a small, and a very gentle, hand was placed on his arm. It was Elena. She was not afraid of him. Her eyes, when he looked at her, were not filled with horror or with judgment. They were filled with a deep, quiet, and very profound compassion. "No, Clayton," she said, her voice a soft, steady, and very firm sound. She took the bucket from his hands and poured the poisoned water onto the thirsty ground. "Your fight is over. Your debt is paid. It is time to come home." She was not just speaking of the small, dusty valley where her own, ruined home was. She was speaking of a different kind of home. A home for his own, very wounded, and very weary soul. She took his hand, her small, gentle hand, a stark, and a very beautiful contrast to his own scarred, and very bloody one. And she led him away from the church of bones, away from the graveyard of his own making. The journey back was a long, and a very quiet, and a very painful one. The wound in his side was a deep one, and a fever began to set in. He was a man who was now at war not with an external enemy, but with his own rebelling body. Eleanor was no longer the frightened, helpless girl. She was a woman. She was a healer. She was her grandfather's granddaughter. She tended to his wound, using the simple and the very effective herbal remedies of her own people. She found them water. She found them food. She was his guide, his protector, his quiet, steady, and very much needed anchor in a sea of pain and a delirious, feverish darkness. They arrived back at the ruins of her valley, not as a victorious warrior and his rescued prize, but as two very weary and very wounded survivors. To people who had been to hell and back, and who had in the process forged a new, and a very different, and a very unbreakable kind of bond. The price of his soul had been a high one. It had been paid in blood, in pain, in the resurrection of a ghost he had thought was long dead. But as he lay in the cool, quiet darkness of a makeshift shelter, with the gentle, competent hands of the girl who had become his daughter tending to him, he began to realize that perhaps, in the end, it was a price that had been worth paying. He had lost his peace. He had lost his solitude. But he had, in the most unexpected and the most painful of ways, perhaps, just perhaps, found a new, and a very different, and a very much better reason to live. The weeks that followed their return to the valley were a time of quiet, and of a very slow, and a very painful kind of healing. The land itself was in mourning, the blackened, skeletal ruins of the settlement a constant, silent testament to the terrible, violent storm that had passed through it. The ghosts of the dead were a palpable presence, their whispers carried on the same lonely wind that had once carried the sounds of their laughter. Clayton Graves was a man in a fever dream, his body at war with the poison of the stiletto wound, his mind a battlefield of his own resurrected ghosts. He was a prisoner of his own wounded flesh, and of his own very haunted past. Eleanor was his jailer, his nurse, his anchor. She was a creature of a quiet, and a very profound, and a very practical strength. She did not coddle him. She did not pity him. She tended to him with a no-nonsense and a very effective competence. She brewed the bitter, healing teas from the dessert plants. She cleaned and dressed his wound, her touch gentle but firm. And she talked to him. She did not talk of the massacre. She did not talk of the hunt. She spoke of the future. She spoke of rebuilding. She spoke of the stubborn and yielding and very beautiful resilience of life. "The corn will grow again, Clayton," she would say, her voice a low, steady murmur as she spooned a thin, nourishing broth into his mouth. "The houses can be rebuilt. A home is not a thing of wood and stone. It is a thing of the heart." And slowly, painstakingly, her quiet, insistent hope began to do what no bullet, no blade, had ever been able to do. It began to pierce the hard, cynical, and very broken armor of his soul. He began to heal. The fever broke. The pain in his side subsided to a dull, manageable ache. And as his body began to mend, he began to see the world, and himself, through her eyes. He saw not a ghost, not a killer, not a legend. He saw a man. A man who had been broken, a man who had been lost, a man who was, for the first time in a very long and a very lonely time, not alone. And he began to work. He was still weak, his movements slow and stiff, but he was a man who had been defined, his entire life, by action. He could not be still. He began to help her. Together, the old, scarred cowboy and the young, resilient girl, they began the slow, arduous, and very sacred work of rebuilding. They cleared the rubble. They salvaged what they could. They laid the foundations for a new, and a smaller, but a much stronger, home. They were not just rebuilding a house. They were rebuilding a life. They were weaving a new rope, a new bond from the frayed, and the very bloody, threads of their two, very different, and very broken, lives. The news of the demise of Ricardo Alcuquillo Vargas and his red knives, a story that was already becoming a wild, and a very exaggerated, legend in the border towns, eventually reached the ears of the outside world. A month after their return, a small, and a very official-looking, patrol of Arizona Rangers rode into the valley. They were led by a young, ambitious, and very by-the-book captain named Miller. He had come to investigate the massacre and the rumors of a single, ghostly avenger. He found Clayton and Elena, two dusty, and a very determined, figures, working on the frame of their new home. He saw the old, healed scars on Clayton's face, the new, healing wound in his side. He saw the cold, hard, and very professional way the old man's eyes took his measure. And he saw the fierce, protective, and very much unwavering gaze of the young girl who stood beside him. He was a lawman. He had questions. He had regulations. But he was also a man of the frontier. And he knew, with a deep, and a very wise, and a very practical instinct, that there were some stories that were best left as legends. There were some graves that were best left undisturbed. And there were some forms of justice that were older, and more true, than any law that was written in a book. He did not ask about the Church of Bones. He did not ask about the 20 men who had disappeared from the face of the earth. He simply, and with a new, and a very genuine, respect, touched the brim of his hat. "It seems," he said, his voice a quiet, and a very official, and a very final statement, "that the Red Knives gang has finally retired." He then turned his horse and rode away, leaving the two, solitary, and very much alive, figures to the quiet, and the very hard won, peace of their own, new, and very personal, resurrection. The departure of the Arizona Rangers was a quiet, and spoken absolution. It was a closing of a chapter, a final, official turning of the page on a bloody, and a very necessary, piece of frontier history. The world of laws and of men, had looked into the heart of their valley, had seen the brutal, righteous justice that had been done there, and had, with a quiet, and a very wise, nod, decided to look away. Clayton and Eleanor were left to their peace. But the peace of the West is a hard, and a very fragile, thing. The ghosts of what had happened were not so easily banished. They were a part of the land now, a part of the silence, a part of the very air they breathed. The scars of the memory were on them both. For Clayton, they were a thing of the night, a quiet, brooding stillness that would sometimes settle over him as he sat on the porch of their new, small, and very sturdy home. His eyes on the distant, dark line of the horizon, his mind 1,000 miles, and 100 years, away. He was a man who was in a constant, quiet conversation with the ghosts of the men he had killed, and the men he had failed to save. For Elena, the scars were a thing of a new, and a very hard one, maturity. The innocent, carefree girl was gone, replaced by a young woman of a quiet, and a very profound, and a very deep, and a very sad, wisdom. She had seen the worst of the world, and she had not broken. She had, instead, been tempered, her spirit a thing of a new, and a very beautiful, and a very unbending, kind of steel. They were a strange, and a very unlikely, family. The old scarred, and very much haunted gunfighter, and the young, resilient, and very much alive girl who was his daughter in all the ways that truly mattered. They were two solitary, wounded souls who had found in each other a quiet, and a very necessary, and a very healing, kind of sanctuary. They did not just rebuild their home. They rebuilt a community. The story of their stand, the legend of the ghost of Scorpion Gulch and the angel of the valley, spread, a whisper on the wind. And a new kind of people began to be drawn to their small, quiet valley. They were not the hopeful, naive dreamers of the first wave. They were the survivors, the outcasts, the broken, men and women who had been chewed up and spit out by the harsh and forgiving machinery of the frontier, and who were looking not for a new start, but for a last, and a very quiet, and a very safe place to be. Their small, two-person settlement began to grow. A disgraced, alcoholic doctor from a far-off city, a family of black sharecroppers who had fled the violent, racist world of the Reconstruction South, a Chinese railroad worker who had escaped the brutal, near-slave conditions of the labor camps. They were a collection of the forgotten, of the unwanted, of the other, and in the valley of Clayton Graves and Elena, they found a home. Clayton did not become their leader. He did not become their lawman. He was simply Clayton, their quiet, watchful, and very much respected elder. His presence was a silent and a very powerful promise. A promise that this place, this small, fragile, and very unlikely community of the broken, was a place that was protected, a place that was safe, a place where the wolves of the outside world would find no easy prey. He taught them. He taught them how to read the land, how to find the water, how to survive, and he taught them how to fight. He did not teach them to be gunfighters. He taught them to be a community, to stand together, to be a wall. And Elena was the heart. She was the healer, the teacher, the quiet, steady, and very much beloved center of their new, and a very strange, and a very beautiful world. She was the living, breathing testament to the fact that even in the ashes of the greatest of tragedies, a new, and a very different, and a very beautiful, kind of life could grow. The scars of the memory were still there. They would always be there, but they were no longer just the scars of a tragedy. They were the scars of a victory of the human spirit, a victory of a small, and a very unlikely, and a very beautiful, community of the broken. The years passed, and the small, unlikely settlement in the hidden valley grew. It was not a town, not in the traditional sense. It had no saloon, no jail, no single, overarching law. It was a community, a tribe, a collection of solitary, wounded souls who had found in each other a new, and a very different, and a very real, kind of family. They called their home Vale de la Sombra, the Valley of the Shadow, a name that was a quiet, and a very fitting, tribute to the man who was their silent, and their very much beloved, guardian. Clayton Graves grew old. The fire in his pale blue eyes was banked, replaced by a deep quiet, and a very peaceful ember. The ghost of the regulator was a quiet, sleeping thing, a legend that was now a part of the valley's own, very private, mythology. He was a man who had, at long last, found a home, not just for his body, but for his own, very weary soul. Elena was a woman now, a leader, a healer, the matriarch of their strange, and their very beautiful tribe. She had married the son of the sharecropper, a good, strong, and a very kind man. And she had a daughter of her own, a small, fiery, and a very beautiful girl, with her own dark, desert eyes, and with the pale, startling, and very much inherited blue eyes of the man she called her grandfather. The world outside, the world of progress, of railroads, of a new, and a very different, kind of law, was creeping closer. But the valley remained a sanctuary, a secret, a place that was protected not by guns, but by a reputation, by a legend. The legend of the scarred, old cowboy who lived in the hills, and of the terrible, and a very final, justice that came to any who were foolish enough to disturb his peace. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a long, golden, and a very peaceful light over the valley, Clayton sat on the porch of his small, sturdy cabin, a place that was no longer a tomb, but a home. He was watching his granddaughter, who was playing in the dust at his feet, her laughter a sound of a pure, and a very simple, and a very beautiful, kind of joy. He knew that his own long, and a very bloody, and a very lonely, trail was at an end. He was a man who had been a killer, a ghost, a hermit, and now, in the final, quiet, and a very unexpected, chapter of his life, he was a grandfather. He looked out at the valley, at the small, peaceful community that was his legacy. He had not built it with his hands. He had not led it with his words. He had protected it with his own, and a very terrible, and a very necessary, darkness. He was the last of the regulators, the last of a breed of men who had lived by a hard, and a very bloody, and a very lonely, code. And he had in the end, in this one small, and a very hidden, and a very beautiful corner of the world, regulated. He had brought a final, and a very lasting, and a very just, kind of order. He closed his eyes, the warm, gentle sun on his old scarred face, the sound of his granddaughter's laughter sweet, and a very final, kind of music. The ghost of Scorpion Gulch was at peace. The last regulator was home. And his long, and his very bloody, and his very human stand was, at long last, over.